We'll go ahead and open up to Joshua chapter 12. Joshua 12, and we'll begin there this morning. We're covering several chapters. And of course, the reason that we are lumping several chapters together here is because no one wants to read these chapters out loud. There's a lot of names here, and we're going to deal with that, with the names of the people, the names of the territories, but we won't have a test on pronunciation. I think these chapters are important, and I don't want the idea that we're covering several of them at once to suggest I think they're of diminished importance. But I think that our appreciation for their importance is a developed appreciation and one that is hard to draw out in a class like this. But I don't want to just skim over and miss the importance of what's happening here. There's really two sections. Chapter 12 really belongs with the chapters we've been looking at as he's listing out these kings that have been defeated. And starting in chapter 13, we have the introduction to the dividing of the territories, and that's going to continue on into chapters 18 and 19. We're dividing the territory up here between a really smaller portion of Israel, and then it'll be the remaining 7 tribes as we come into chapter 18. But there is some distinction, I think, as we begin chapter 18, and we'll note that on Wednesday as we get into that section. But we open up chapter 12, and there's a few things to note here in this chapter, in addition to there's a lot of names. But as we begin listing the names of all the kings that are defeated, where does that start? Who are the first kings defeated, listed? Yeah, the east side of the Jordan, Sihon and Og, all right? And I think that's important because we're going back a little bit before the book of Joshua, and what does that say about Joshua's campaign along with these other kings being mentioned? Because Joshua was not leading Israel at the time that Sihon and Og were defeated.
It's a continuity.
Yeah.
It's the same campaign, really.
Yes. Okay. So Joshua's coming into this territory now is a continuation of what started, just like everything else Joshua is doing, right? He is continuing what Moses has already done. So the Sihon and Og were the beginning, the sort of real beginning of the conquering of Canaan. Now there are distinctions that we would draw. We have drawn those. The crossing over the Jordan is a distinction, and that has its own ceremony and sort of monument. But he's reaching back to say this started back here, right? That's when the conquering began. And it was sort of a promise, right? Moses refers to that as a way of saying, you can go do this. We've already done it, right? We've already taken Sihon and Og. And so it's already the beginnings of what we're going to see as we go into the Canaan proper there on the western side of the Jordan. Now, what we're going to see beginning in verse 7 is something that we already see in these first few verses of chapter 12, and that is that Sihon and Og are not the only kings listed. What does that tell you about the territory on the eastern side of the Jordan?
They've been more expensive than we initially think of.
Okay, you remember so far on the western side. In the south, there was one king of Jerusalem who called the other kings together to form this resistance to go against Gibeon. Then in the north, you had the king of Hazor, who it explicitly says was the king over all these other kings, right? And so you have 2 kings highlighted both in the south and in the north as Joshua's coming in. And there it's spelled out, they're gathering other cities and other rulers to them. And we're even told that they are sort of under the reign of this one king. So you have some degree of independent nations, but under maybe a vassalage of one nation or one king. That's probably what was happening with Sihon and Og, is that you have Sihon, and he would be the ruler over this territory, but you would have smaller kingdoms under the reign of Sihon, and the same thing with Og. That seems to be what's being spelled out here. That's a much more reasonable explanation than, again, what some commentators will do and just say, well, they're just embellishing and adding names so that it sounds better. I don't think that's it at all. I think the idea is that we're given the summary. They defeated Sihon and everybody he was over. And so it's being more spelled out in this instance. And we'll talk about why that is in just a moment. Okay, so then we see the same thing as we come down into the kings that Joshua has defeated, beginning with Jericho and Ai, and then going on through those kings throughout the southern portion and then throughout the northern portion of that territory. And what do you think is the significance of this list being listed out as it is?
Those who read it would know of those kings, know of those territories, and these are real places.
All right, so for one, it would be familiar to the people first reading it. What else?
Serve as a reminder to the children of Israel in the future what great things God has done.
Yeah, I think that is the critical key, is that they could look back and remember what God had done for them. And the emphasis, it's almost poetic in the way that it goes about it. Once we get down here to verse 9, the king of Jericho, 1. The king of Ai, which is beside Bethel, 1. It's a little bit of a dramatic counting off. Like if you were counting out money for somebody and you were trying to make a big deal, you'd say, that's 1, that's 2, right? You just put them down one at a time so that you're making kind of a production. And I think that's what's happening here, is we're making kind of a production to count out and list all the kings that have been defeated so that they can look back and go, wow, 31 kingdoms wiped out, just one after another, and simply God has provided the victory. I think we do the same thing when somebody in commenting on this said this is Israel's trophy case. And I think, obviously, with much more import than any trophy case, I think there's something to that. Years ago, Amy's dad was having a reunion with his classmates, and they had won a state championship. And so we were putting pictures and videos that we had captured of that together to make a slideshow for them to watch. And there was a slide where it had all of the teams that they had beaten and what the scores were and everything. And that was in the trophy case in, I don't know, Midfield or Fairfield, wherever it was he went to high school. And I don't even know if any of those schools still exist, but he did, and all those people that played with him did, and they loved it. I mean, these 70-something-year-old men looking back at just glory days, right? Oh, what great remembrances those were. How much more a nation looking back and having each king listed out and say, man, just every single nation we came up against. 31 nations fell before God's people. And that puts any trophy we have to pale in comparison. And so I want us to try to appreciate, even though we don't know the names of these kings, or at least aren't familiar with them as they would be in their power and so forth, that it would have been a daunting thing to read this list and see that Israel just mowed over them. And that is, God kept his promise. And so I think there's drama here that doesn't feel like drama to us, but just that listing out in emphasized fashion each of the kings that has been defeated. Well, as we pick up in chapter 13, then now we're going to start dividing the land. But before we actually get into the dividing of the land, what are we told about Joshua?
He's old.
He's old, right? And it's kind of emphasized Joshua was old and advanced in years. So Yahweh said to him, you are old and advanced in years. and so from the text standpoint, it's really emphasizing that point. But he says you're old and advanced in years, and yet what? There's much land to be conquered. Now, what point do you think is being made there?
There's work for the children of Israel still to do.
Yeah, that really, it sounds like won't be Joshua's work, right? You are on your way out, right? You're about at retirement, but there's still work to do. And then he says, he lists out the kind of work that they're going to need to do, but what does he say about what they need to do and about God, his own role in that? That's right. There's still work to do. There's still land to claim, but they'll do it, and I'll do it for them, right? So there's I think, a few lessons to learn there. Number one, understand that what has been said, what has God said about the land already as far as their battles and so forth. We talked about it at the end of chapter 11. Yeah, it's done, right? I've already accomplished it. We've won the battles. The victory is already there. And now he's saying, but there's still work to do. Both of those things can be true, right? From the standpoint of the full military campaign, right, with all of Israel aligning up against all the kings of Canaan, that's done. That's over with, right? That's what took the 5 to 7 years, however long. And that's completed, but individual tribes still have to go do the sort of leftover work of actually claiming and inhabiting the city, which will include running out the leftovers, right? Whoever is left in those cities. It's not the major military campaign, but it is work, right? It still has to be done, and it is work that is still dangerous, right? They're still fighting. It's not like they're just going in there to people that have no military. We're going to see a little bit later. That's one of the complaints people are going to say. They still got chariots. They still got horses. And Joshua's going to say, that doesn't matter for you, right? You can still go up and take that. So it is a lesser work than what has already been accomplished, but it is still work. Now, let's think a little bit further about that. All right, so Joshua, we've already talked about Joshua being that type. Do you see any connections between what's happening here with Joshua and what Jesus accomplishes and our part in that?
It's done. It's ours to take.
Yeah, that's right. Okay, so one of the things that you often hear is when Jesus says, the denominational world, you see this a lot. When he's on the cross and he says, it is finished, that means there's nothing else to do. You can't do anything. There's no work you can do, right? That's what that it is finished means. But what if that's like Joshua 11? And it is finished means the victory is won. But you still got to go take the territory. You still got to go and do your part to claim what God has already won for you. And so I think there's a lot of connection to be drawn there as Joshua is on the way. I read one commentator that said it this way, that missed that point. And this commentator said that what we see here is Joshua is getting old and advanced in years. He's going to die with the work left undone, but Jesus won't leave the work undone. I don't think that's the point. I think Joshua did accomplish his work. And the work that remains is what God has left for the people to do. And I think in the same way, Jesus did accomplish his work. And what remains is for us to go with God's power and with God's protection to go and claim what he has already promised and won for us. But, as we're going to continue to see, they don't all claim it, do they? It was theirs. And in the same way, he's claimed it, or he has won it. The victory is already there, and it only remains for people to claim it. And yet, a great many people will not claim it, will they? They will just simply leave conquered territory unclaimed. And what a sad state that is. But that is the picture. This is not a contrast with the work Jesus does, but it is a more accurate picture of the work that Jesus does. All right.
On that note, I was thinking about when we get to Judges, it'll say almost identical language of the nations that are left there. It says that God left them for testing. And if we make the comparison to like Hebrews does, that Jesus did learn obedience by the things that he suffered. He did gain the victory. Now, the test is for the children of Israel. The test is for the people of God. Will they follow their forerunner, Joshua, Jesus,
Yes.
in the same path that he took to victory?
Yes, absolutely. And in this case, they won't. And in many cases in our time, they won't. And so, but they can. It's available. Okay. Now, as we continue on in chapter 13, we begin to divide the land. And really, before we get into dividing the land, I think chapter 13, the rest of chapter 13, is telling you who won't be included in this division of the land and why. And so, obviously, the first who won't be included in this division of the land are the tribes that are over here on the east side of the Jordan, Reuben, Gad, and Manasseh. And so he goes through and he goes ahead and describes what they have already inherited, right? And lays out their territories. And so that is much of chapter 13, going through all of that until we get down to the last verse. And there's one more tribe who will not be included in the dividing of the territories. And who is that? Levi. All right. And why won't Levi be included? All right, because the Lord was their inheritance. Moses did not give it an inheritance to the tribe of Levi, because Yahweh, the God of Israel, is their inheritance as he had promised to them. Now, we're going to see what their inheritance, that there is land inheritance, but it is not a total territory like we see in these instances. There's going to be cities of the Levites throughout the territories. There's going to be the cities of refuge throughout the territories, and we're going to see that a little bit later. But as we're just going straight through and we're listing out all of these places that people have inherited, I think this first chapter this is why these aren't going to be included. All right. So picking up in chapter 14, then we're told about what's fixing to happen. That these are the territories which the sons of Israel inherited in the land of Canaan, which Eleazar the priest and Joshua the son of Nun and the heads of the households, the tribes of the sons of Israel, apportioned them for an inheritance. Now, what is the means by which they apportion the territory? By lots. All right. What does that mean?
The decision is from the Lord.
Yes, the decision is from the Lord. This is not just luck of the draw, as we might say, but it is trusting to providence. And so it's not, the lots being cast before the people shows that it's not just Joshua playing favorites or Eleazar. They see the lots fall, right? And whereas we might look at that and think that gives a certain sense of illegitimacy to the process, because would you want your territory to be assigned to you by well, if it's God deciding how the lot falls, then yes, that is. And that's what's happening. That's what's being communicated to the people is you're being given land based on what God says. So if somebody comes and complains, who are they complaining against, right? And so I think that's the clarity that's offered here is we're looking, why would they choose lots? That's the way that they can say God's deciding this. However that falls, it's God's choice. Does somebody have a comment there? Okay. So that's the way that this is going to be gone about. And then, and again, it reminds us, it did not give the inheritance to the Levites. Then starting in verse 6, before we get into the tribal divisions, who first receives their inheritance? All right. This is a unique element in this division, that it's going to highlight Caleb receiving his individual, or his family's inheritance as distinct from the rest of the tribes. Why do you think he gets highlighted like this?
He was one of the only two exceptions.
Yes.
He was one of the, well, actually, can I make a point there? We say Joshua and Caleb, they were the only ones who survived that 40 years. There was another name at the beginning of this chapter, Eleazar, who was an adult at that time. And so apparently we see that the tribe of Levi was accepted from that census.
Yeah, that's possible, or an implication there. But yes, from the standpoint of, broadly speaking, these two men, Joshua and Caleb, are distinct from the rest of the tribe of Israel. That they stood alone as Israel refused to go into the territory. And so Joshua, where's Joshua? Well, he's the whole book, right? He gets the whole book. Caleb at least gets this extended section. Tony?
Yeah, you may have been going to say this, but I didn't want to miss it. Just that there is a highlighting of Caleb. It's like, okay, y'all remember what happened back there? I'm bringing that forward. This is tying these, connecting these books together.
Yeah.
This is the same story. This is the same Caleb, and God kept his promise, and we're shining a spotlight on that.
Yeah, and we're going to make another point about carrying forward here in just a moment with the daughters of Zelophehad. I say just a moment. That probably will not get in today. But so Caleb is highlighted, and not just from the standpoint of here's what his territory was, but he's highlighted in a way that says he's the same as he ever was, which is Caleb comes forward and says, can I go get my land now? And not only does he say that, but what does he say about his ability to do that? Yeah, I hadn't lost anything. God has continued. So not only did God bless him with survival, but with vitality up to this point. So that when he enters the land, he's actually able to enjoy the land these 40 years later. And it's not just like he's able to barely cross the finish line and then die. But I think there's an aspect there of God blesses him even more than that. That he gets what he should have gotten 40 years ago for his courage, that he ends up being able to appreciate this inheritance. So he goes with all of this vigor and is able to take this place that was formerly called Kiriath Arba. And why was it called Kiriath Arba?
Named after the guy who lived there.
Who and what was he?
He was one of the giants.
He was one of the giants. Why did the people not want to go in and take the land?
It's full of giants.
That's full of giants. And Caleb says, let me go get the giant's hill. Right? So he doesn't just say, let me go take the easy territory. He says, I'm going to go slay the giant. And that's the territory he gets. So I just think there's just a wonderful completion. And we'll see him referenced again as we get into the book of Judges. But I just think that's a wonderful rejoinder to Caleb's story to see this carry through all the way to this point. All right, so then chapter 15, we begin allotting the territory. And who is first up in the allocation of territory? Judah. Why do you think Judah gets preeminence here in the dividing of the territories?
He was the most blessed when Jacob blessed his sons.
Yeah, if you recall, Judah ends up with a blessing that comes down through the sort of the dismissal of the first few sons for various reasons. And so it comes down to Judah. And so Judah is getting sort of a firstborn place here in the listing of the tribes. Now, of course, beyond that, we know Judah's going to have the ultimate blessing and priority as they are the ones that produce the seed, right? And that Jesus is going to come through the tribe of Judah. So this is listed out here. Next, we have in chapter 16, we have Ephraim's territory that is being allotted, and then Manasseh's territory. Now, what do you think is the significance of that they are the next in line? Yeah, so Joseph's who Jacob wished was his firstborn. And the way he circumvented firstborn rules was to make the sons of Joseph his own sons. All right, which allows him to give Joseph a double portion, right? They each have a portion, but obviously that means Joseph's getting two portions. And so this is a way that Jacob was able to elevate Joseph to this position. And so they are given even that position of prominence here. And we're going to continue to see that throughout the history. Ephraim is just a major player. They are one of the most prominent tribes of the northern kingdom. And so they end up being very blessed here. Brad, did you have a? Okay. All right. Now, as you're coming through here, reading all of these landmarks, and it's a lot, right? I mean, it's a lot of landmarks. Beginning there with Judah, you just see all the little towns that are mentioned, the little landmarks that are mentioned, and so forth. What do you make of that? I mean, how's that helpful to record all of that?
You know what land is part of that tribe, and you know that each tribe was to have its own land and divvy it up amongst the families, and they were to do that generationally.
Yeah, generationally. There's the word. They were supposed to do that generation. This is not just here's how it starts and however it ends up is however it ends up. This is you keep coming back to this, right? It ought to be that generations later they would be able to say, now where were the landmarks, right? How do we go back and figure out what our land is? We've lost all generational connections to land for the most part. But that generally speaking throughout history, people have appreciated that in other places. Not so much in America. America's been, from its inception, been a place where people move around more than they stay in place. But in most places throughout the world, you have that sort of generational attachment. Amy and I have been watching this period show from England, and it's in the country, in farm country. And this guy doesn't understand. There's this woman. She becomes a widow. She's taken over the running of this farm that her husband was running. She's got two boys, and things look precarious. It looks like she might lose everything. And this guy just says, "You need to just sell while you can and get out." And she looks at him like, "What are you talking about? This is my husband's land, and it were his fathers before him, and his fathers before him. And this is the inheritance of my sons. How could I take that away from them?" And he's just looking at it like, it's just property. No. I think these people were supposed to look at this land as God's own inheritance. How could I ever give that up? And you'd want to go back again and again and again. I'll tell you, looking at these landmarks, they're unfamiliar to us. But, in doing our own genealogical research, there's a Russell Cemetery down in Somerville that was a part of a 1,200-acre farm owned by Christopher Russell, who's my sixth great-grandfather. And so we got to doing all that. And I'll tell you what, I was pretty interested to know where all that land was, because that was my grandfather. And it was interesting to me. It was connected to be able to know how far did that go. And incidentally, a relative still owns it. And we went down there, and he said, over this way, it went to this part. And he'd bought it all back up and everything. And all of my ancestors that I didn't know are all buried there in that cemetery. We went to the county courthouse, and that guy's handwritten will is down there in Morgan County records, and it tells about all that land. It got real interesting to me, because that's my people. We're distant from this because it's not our people. But if it were your people, you might care a little bit more. We were talking recently about land that my father-in-law owns over in Walker County. And that land is a piece of land that his, I don't know, however many great-grandfathers owned and was given for his participation in the Revolutionary War. Now, I don't know what he did in the war to deserve land in Walker County. Probably not something great. But nevertheless, he's got that land, and it's still in the family. And we were talking, we were like, I wonder what will happen. I wonder if Pop will sell that land. And Anna goes, sell that land? That's ours, because our ancestor participated in forming this country. And I was like, man, she's taking my sermon seriously. But I do appreciate that whole sense of, hey, there's connection there. There's meaning there. And it's not just a piece of property. It's a piece of property that means something. And this property means God has done for you what he said he would do for you. And so that they could go back again and again and again and say, let's set it back in order. And that's what they were supposed to do. Even if things started to get out of place and land started to be bought up by this tribe or this tribe, there was supposed to be something in place that they could go and say, let's set it back in order. Let's set it back in order. Now, they didn't, but that's what they were supposed to do. And that's what this is supposed to do. So we at least if we can't feel as connected as they did, I want to appreciate why they would have felt connected or why they should have felt connected to this text. Now, what does that do for us? When we read all of these place names, what do you do with that? What do you think?
Two things. Tony mentioned the historicity thing. Okay, it's going to be hard to nail down every single place, but we can nail down a lot of them.
Yeah.
But number two, Sherry and I were talking about this, and she thought about 1 Peter 1:4 about having a place in heaven reserved for you. God reserved this for these people, and he followed through. He's going to follow through on that promise as well.
Absolutely. That's our promised land. Kevin?
Also, when you read the sentence, cities that you did not build, here's a list of cities. It's not just ethereal. These are real cities that he can say, I gave you this and this and this and this and this, which you did not build.
Absolutely. Marshall?
Thinking about fighting for their inheritance and us fighting for our inheritance. It wasn't just a piece of land, and as you talk about, maybe things being sold and you have to figure out where the boundary markers are, but for the immediate generation, this is the land you have to clear out. You have to get these Canaanites out, and I think we are kind of removed from that because we have a standing army for the United States that takes care of that, but what if we had to be responsible for our own land? And so, in the same way, we do have an inheritance. Are we going to fight for our land, our inheritance as well?
Yes, absolutely. Tony?
Just one more thing, how when I read something like this, I try to put myself in their place. When they would read it, it really meant something to them. It means a lot more to them than it does to me. I just feel that connection that, man, that was meaningful.
Yes, yes. I think when they're inheriting this land, and we're going to get into this with Zelophehad and his daughters, when they're inheriting this land, what all are they thinking about? Like, when all this is being written down, how far in the future do you think that they are thinking or are supposed to be thinking?
Generation after generation after generation.
They're thinking generation after generation after generation. They're not just thinking of, let me get mine, but they are thinking of providing an inheritance to generations. And that's what God wanted, was to provide an inheritance to generations. Now, I think that we do well to try to think that way, even in physical terms for generations, but more so to think in terms of spiritual inheritance, generation after generation. What am I setting in place and what am I doing that will best provide for the spiritual inheritance that my great-great-grandchildren that I'll never meet will inherit from what I'm doing now? That's what was being set in place here, is things that were supposed to be inherited 1,000 years from now. We want to be setting things in place that reverberate and have that kind of long-term inheritance down the road, instead of just thinking very cut off. We're cut off from previous generations. We're cut off from future generations. So much of this puts them into the place of receiving what has come and preparing for what is in the future. And we want to set our place, our minds in that. And then one more thing I would just note about this from our standpoint What tribe do we most closely relate to here? Good guess. and yes, through Jesus. But from the standpoint of our inheritance, Levi. We're the kingdom of priests. We're the ones who haven't been given some specific land that God has lined out, but I am your inheritance, right? And so as we're reading through this, we're the Levites that God has said, I will be your inheritance. And so, so we make that connection. Well, briefly then, the daughters of Zelophehad. These daughters are mentioned several times in the Old Testament. It starts back in Numbers chapter 27. In Numbers chapter 27, they come to Moses and they are concerned that they are not going to inherit. Why? Because there are no sons. Sons are who inherit, and there are no sons of Zelophehad. And what is concerning about that to them?
Have no place in the tribe as far as the land is concerned.
Yeah, and it says, what about our father's name? Side note, this among several other women, they're listed in the Bible as champions of women's rights. They're concerned about their father's rights. What about his name? And he does not deserve this, in fact, because he didn't rebel like Korah did. That's what they say. Yeah, Korah deserved to be cut off, but not our father. And so how does he maintain his name and his line in Israel? Because he's a faithful man. And Moses says, you're right. And here's how that happens. Now then, in chapter 36, they come back again, or they come up again, because other people are concerned. What's the concern in chapter 36?
Marrying outside the tribe.
What if these daughters marry outside the tribe, and then that land is going to sort of gravitate to those other tribes? And Moses says, you're right. And so they can marry who they wish, but it must be within the tribe. All right? And so they've got to marry within Manasseh. And so now we've got two concerns being addressed here. Now they come up again here in Joshua 17. Why do you think they're being brought up yet again?
Because God's commands are to be followed.
God's commands are to be followed. I think it also speaks to their faithfulness. Here are women. What are they? Back in Numbers 27. Just think about this, and we'll bring this up Wednesday. Think about this. When they bring this up in chapter 27, what does it say about their thoughts about the promised land? And so we'll think about that, and we'll begin with that on Wednesday.